Hello YouTube, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to talk to you about one of my favorite works in fantasy of all time, the first book in that series. It's Nine Princes of Amber by Roger Zelazny. We've talked actually about the Chronicles of Amber series. I used it, it was one of my 10 best fantasy series of all time, so I'll actually link that to you below in case you want to check out my other works and where that falls in the list. I've also talked about some of his stories before. I've done reviews of some of his things before, like Rose for Ecclesiastes, and there's some other ones too that we'll be doing. We've done them already, and there's going to be some other ones out there too. He is somebody who's a science fiction and fantasy writer, and he's not afraid, and sometimes horror stuff too, and he's not afraid to mix genres and stuff. As a reminder, Roger Zelazny as a writer is not somebody who's going to tend to write the same thing over and over again. He doesn't go back to his great works, with the Chronicles of Amber basically being the one lone exception. After he has these great works, like Lord of Darkness, for example, or something like that, he's not going to go back to it and do it again. He might do something that's sort of the same genre with different mythologies, but he won't go back and do the same thing again. Even when he wins awards for it, he's always looking for something new. And when he does do something that seems like on the surface is going to be similar to what other writers are doing at the same time, he's going to have a different take on it, a different spin on it, and such. That's just who he is as a writer. And again, the Chronicles of Amber is the one lone exception to that, because there's ultimately 10 books in the series, in 2 5-set series. And today we're going to look at the first of those books. Also, as a reminder, anything that Zelazny touches is going to have a mythic element to it. He generally will bring in and write in mythoses in other sort of that already exist, from the Cthulhu mythos that he's written in to various mythologies. He's written in the Egyptian mythology, Hindu, and such are his major sort of mythoses. In the Chronicles of Amber, though, this is where he sort of will create a mythos, and his goal here is to create this giant sort of mythic feel to the story, and he does so swimmingly. And so we're going to be looking at the first book. Now I have it in this giant 10-book volume tome. Like a lot of books that used to be written, this is not a very long read, even for today. The first book in this giant tome is like 120 pages long. It won't take you long to read. In its original version, it's like 140, 150 in novel size. It was published in 1970. Nine Princes in Amber. It's going to be set in this world that Zelazny creates that kind of combines science fiction and fantasy, which he was not the... This is actually pretty common during that time. There's lots of people that are going to be doing it, like Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern. Feels both science fiction and fantasy. It's in a science fiction world, but it's fantasy-esque in that people are riding dragons. But there's other things too, and in a low-tech world. But they're rediscovering flamethrowers, and they're on a colony planet from Earth and stuff. So it has both feels to it. And this is not. This was common during this era. There were a lot of works that kind of had both, which is why a lot of the early fantasy in the 70s and the 80s, like video games, board games, role-playing games, will regularly mix science fiction in with their fantasy. Whether it's role-playing games that have modules set in science fiction areas, or having spaceships crashing on, a fantasy world, or having realizing that you're super secretly a colony of Earth all along on your fantasy world with magic and dragons and stuff. This is very common in this era, this sort of mixing of the two. So, and things like Ultima, the first video game from 1980, to Might and Magic video games, all the way up through the 90s, because that's kind of tradition and trajectory that it had established, are going to be a part of this. So this is not something new. And Zelazny's going to do that here in this work. I'm not going to give you a spoiler for it, but what I will say is that what Zelazny is doing is setting up this giant 5-book series, and he's going to come back to it later on. And he's going to write the rest of the books throughout the first 5-book series, which has a definitive end to it. Finishes it up in the late 70s. So he can be writing these throughout the 70s and coming back to them. These are not full of action. There's not a massive amount of action sequences. If you're coming to this as a traditional fantasy enthusiast, then you're kind of expecting there to be like one fight scene per chapter or something like that. That's not going to be happening. There aren't combat scenes that don't continue the plot. You know, for example, there's a book R.A. Salvatore called Streams of Silver where they're out adventuring, and because they're in a dangerous place called the Troll Shaws, of course they're going to have to fight a bunch of trolls, like hundreds of trolls in a night setting. Our characters are going to have to do so. That's kind of the part of fantasy, right? You're going to have these fights that don't advance the plot, that aren't a part of, you know, that just happen because you're in a dangerous area, or because, you know, we haven't had a fight scene in a while, so let's have a fight scene. That's not Zelazny's fantasy, just so you know that right up front. But what he does is it's more of, and there's going to feel kind of like a House of Cards, like a pre-House of Cards. And I would not be surprised to find out that Game of Thrones and those sorts of things came from this sort of a Zelazny-esque place, because Zelazny writes a lot of this sort of political fighting, political intrigue, and so forth. And it's very, very influential. This is also influential, very much so, on games and such. The central dynamic is law versus chaos, not good versus evil. And so you're going to have the courts of chaos as the bad guys, as the antagonists, and you're going to have the good guys on the side of law and such. The main character is going to wake up in a hospital on Earth and so forth, not knowing who he is. Basically, the first book is basically going to try to figure out who your main character is, and so forth. Who's helping him? Who are his enemies? Trying to figure out which of his family members are helping him and not helping him out. You find out that there's this big, large family of Amber, people of Amber, and they have this magical ability called Trump magic that they can use using cards, which is this unique form of magic you're not going to see before or since. That they use. They can communicate with each other by holding that person's trump card, and then they can, members of their family can check see if they're alive or dead, and so forth, as well as using the trumps to do things. They can also change the pattern. And by change the pattern, what I mean is they can move from plane to plane. They can change the pattern of places and such. And you're going to find out a lot about this, particularly in the first book. How the magic works, who our main character is. You'll find out he's Corwin, and so forth, and who his family members are. And each of the family members has a very different character. You're ultimately going to realize that there are two sides in this sort of fight for who is going to be taking over the throne of Amber, which is going to be the major sort of issue that's going to be happening for the first few books. Who's going to be on whose sides, and so forth. And they're going to have changing alliances and so forth as these two major factions. And you're going to realize pretty soon that your main character in the first couple of chapters is actually one of the leaders of one of the sides, and that's why he's over at Earth, been banished, and so forth, and no longer has his memory. So you're going to find that in the first couple of chapters. But you're going to follow these characters, follow them, and so forth throughout the story, and throughout their fights with the Courts of Chaos. And the book's going to end after 5 books. It's going to be great. It's going to have a lot of fun stuff happening. And there's going to be, again, a lot of this sort of push between the two major people within the family pushing for the throne. And Corwin's going to be one of the main people pushing for the throne. There's going to be the follow-up books we'll look at separately. The Guns of Avalon's the next book in the series, and so forth. But the first 5 books does conclude with the Courts of Chaos, and it has a very convincing sort of end to the story. And then what he does is he'll come back to Amber, but in the 80s he'll write another 5-book series. But those 5 books are going to be more set for the next generation. They're going to be looking at Corwin's son, Merlin, who's part Chaos. And look at kind of Merlin's story, and so forth. So it'll be kind of going to the next generation. I actually thought those were almost as good as the first series. Not as good, because the first series is the first series. It's this iconic sort of it. But I thought there was a lot of good stuff happening with it. But take a look at the 9 Princes. The first chapter is going to find him waking up in this hospital in upstate New York, not knowing who he is, where he is, or what to do. And by the time he's out, which is probably going to take you it's like 8 pages. I actually read it this morning. I was like, I almost stopped recording this video so I could reread it for like the 5th time because it's just such a fun read. I didn't. I wanted to prioritize this video and doing things today rather than rereading 3 or 4 of the books in the Chronicles series, but it's good stuff. It's so well written, and there's so much fun stuff happening. But by the time you finish the first chapter, you're going to know exactly who your main character's personality is. And you're going to love him. You're going to say, this guy's pretty cool. And you're going to want to root for him and such too. He has some pretty fun moments in the first chapter alone before he even knows his identity or anything else. So you're going to really enjoy that. So that's the first book of the series, Nine Princes in Amber. I know a lot of people I've spoken to have said they like Nine Princesses of Amber better than the rest of the series because there's more action, it's more of a traditional sort of fantasy story, and so forth. But again, it has these different people fighting, different changing allegiances and alliances, so forth. It's kind of this sort of a shifting sort of political landscape in the world of Amber, and all these different planes that they can walk to. And they can grab things and people from those different planes and train them up and such to fight for each other. So it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of great things happening with it. And again, it's not going to take you long to read because it's just 130, 140 pages in a novel. Mine's 120 pages because it's oversized. It's going to take you probably just a couple of hours to read. And this is the good thing about a lot of these things. You could probably read through like all 5 of the Chronicles of Amber in a weekend if you just dedicated a few hours a day to it. Certainly in a week, you'd probably read a book a day if you if you read a couple of hours. Just invested a couple of hours a day. And that's the good thing about a lot of these old books is that you can actually read them pretty quickly because they were not written with these hundreds and hundreds of pages like a Tom Clancy novel or something. They're much smaller and you can read them. They get you into the story and then they get you out of the story. And that was kind of, I think, a lost art with a lot of modern writers or even modern readers that kind of would like that kind of sort of a thing. Anyway. Check it out. I think you're going to really like it. If you've never heard of the Chronicles of Amber, please check it out. And again, I'm going to give you links below, both also to where you can buy it. And then also, I'll also show you to my top 10 fantasy works of all time, so you can check this out. I'll also probably link you to a couple of other things I've done already with reviews for Zelazny's stuff. But check it out. This is hugely influential. It's a great story. It really, really helped to push the law versus chaos thing that Michael Moorcock was working on and already sort of codified, as well as Paul Anderson and his 3 Hearts and 3 Lines, which are major sort of, during the 50s and 60s, this was sort of this major sort of central fantasy conflict. Is not good versus evil like it was in Tolkien's world, and it's not sort of or sort of the previous things like the noble savage versus decadent civilizations of Conan the Barbarian and Howard's works. Instead, it's law versus chaos, which has become the major sort of dominant theme. In fact, it was so dominant that even Dungeons & Dragons just sort of assumed that law versus chaos would be the central conflict of their own world when they created it. It wasn't until a couple of years later that they added the good versus evil layer to it. Anyway. So check it out. It's really good. It's got, and again, he's trying to create this mythic work, and I think he does a great job with it. Do you agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments below if there's anything you want to talk about in the book in more detail, because I don't want to have any spoilers, in this, other than the sort of general things you're going to find out in the first couple of chapters, or sort of character arc that characters are going to be on. If there's something you want to talk about, I'd be happy to engage you with those below. If you like this video, there's no reason not to hit that subscribe button. There's going to be so many more reviews to follow where I sort of unpack forgotten classics of fantasy, horror, and science fiction from the 1800s to the 90s and the 80s. My goal is to give you an opportunity to kind of see a lot of things out there. If you've never heard of them, give you a chance to hear about them and talk about them and kind of give you and unpack them for you, and to find those sort of forgotten classics that we just forget because we're so obsessed with new books. So again, please subscribe. And if you've watched this video all this way, hey, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to invest in my video and myself and this. I really do appreciate it. We all have such busy lives and so many things to do. So I appreciate that you took some time out of your day and invested it in my video. Thank you once again. You have a great day.